chaotic storm of innovation that happens when you have the right people in the room.
7 startups, you guys have definitely kind of perfected your process.
Everything drives on somebody making a profit somewhere.
Welcome to another episode of the BYU Tech Transfer Podcast. Today I'm here with Dr. Anton Bowden over in the Mechanical Engineering Department. Anton, why don't you introduce yourself, a little bit about your research and your background?
Sure. So, professor here in the Mechanical Engineering Department at BYU. I've been at BYU for almost 18 years. Before coming to BYU, I got my PhD in bioengineering at the University of Utah. And then I spent about 4 years in industry at a company called Exponent. Out in their Philadelphia office. I was with their biomechanics practice. And really, that was probably where I got to know a little bit about kind of the industry side of things. We did consulting work with most of the major orthopedic manufacturers. And I got to see kind of behind the curtains. But then came here to BYU about 17 and a half years ago, and kind of launched into studying, spine biomechanics, which is kind of my main area, medical device design, often related to the spine biomechanics, of course.
Yeah, and you've been involved with some startup companies as well, right?
Yeah, so we have, from our lab, we have 27 patents that we've had issued since we've been here at BYU so far, and a bunch more that are under review. And out of those, we've actually had 7 small businesses launch based on those technologies. So that's been great. Yeah,
no, that is fantastic. And so with your perspective, you might have some unique insights into the difference between research-driven innovation and what's important there versus maybe market and commercial innovation, having kind of a foot in both worlds. Have you seen many differences? Is there quite a bit of overlap? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think from a most fundamental perspective, there's a lot of overlap, right? You're trying to solve a problem that you see. I think the main difference on the academic research side innovation is really, there's a few things. One of them is time scale, right? So, when you're in industry, often you're focusing on solving the problem that's kind of in front of you.
The most obvious problem, right? The thing that's holding you up. Yes.
That's right. And maybe a step ahead or a couple steps ahead of that. And really you have to kind of do that, I think, because market forces, right? If you spend a lot of time on something that's not going to bear fruit for, a long time, it's probably going to be hard for your stakeholders to understand that.
Yes.
But in academia, that constraint isn't there. And so you've got the freedom to kind of solve the problem that you think needs to be solved, even if it takes some time to get there. So in one sense, you're kind of liberated from some of the constraints. But the challenge is you're also freed from the mooring of having to have a customer kind of intercede and say, yeah, I really want that. And so there's, I think, more burden on the academic researcher to actually find out what a customer wants, because you're not interacting with them so often.
Yeah, you might phrase that the burden of relevancy, right? I think there's so many different things you can do that finding the one that is important to industry, even though it might be objectively important otherwise, can be a little less tethered to those pressures that industry is seeing, right?
Yeah, so an example. So early on in my career at BYU, we were working on solving this problem. We were trying to understand stress and strain in the ligaments of the body in vivo. And we were attacking that problem by looking in the lab at, cadaver, tendons and ligaments, and then kind of trying to figure out what was happening in vivo based on those. And we came across this really cool insight. We found that not only could we measure the strain in these ligaments by their change in electrical resistance of the tissue itself, right? But that it was actually really accurate and repeatable, and it kind of made a little splash in our academic world. And before we did that, we thought, oh, this is going to be the greatest thing. We should get a patent on this. And I don't know how, but we managed to convince Tech Transfer that we should file a patent on this. And sure enough, the patent sailed through, right? It was
no
new.
prior
Nobody,
art, nothing in the
there's
space.
no prior
Yes.
art. But once it was there and we had it in hand, nobody was interested in this. Like we cared about it because it was something we wanted to do every day. We'd kind of envisioned this device, this little spider that pierced through the skin and measured. But no athlete wants that on them while they're on the court or on the field. And so we didn't understand audience very well. We didn't understand relevance. It was relevant to other folks like us.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we're a pretty small group, and we don't often buy products that do that, right? So, yeah, relevance, highly important. Hopefully we've done better on a lot of other things we've done, but sometimes you get it wrong as a academic
well, I would
researcher.
say with 7 startups, you guys have definitely kind of perfected your process, and I think that that's such a key insight but considering the differences between validating and research, right? Something that hadn't been done, that there was no prior art that was impactful on that side of the field, versus validating in the market, right? In something that people are willing to pay money for, right? That solves a pain point in their day-to-day life. And so, I mean, you've already touched on that a bit, but have you found any additional insights over your career for help for research, maybe specifically researchers, into validating some of their ideas for market fit?
Yeah, I mean, some of this is going to sound really obvious, but it really is, number one, kind of talking to people.
Yes.
Just understanding what it is they actually need. And for my field, that means talking to surgeons and hospital administrators, because even though the end user of a medical device is a person somewhere, they're not the ones buying it.
Right.
And so you have to understand not just the end purpose, but the needs of everybody in that chain. Right.
Well, and really who your customer is. Right. Like if somebody's going to recommend a surgical implant, right, that's going to come through the surgeon to the end user. But the surgeon, right, in that case, might be your actual customer. Yeah.
So, I mean, a surgeon has a certain number of procedures they can do in a day. And even if your technology is like fantastic, if you've cut in half or a quarter the surgeon's throughput by doing that, you probably aren't going to get a lot of traction. And so you have to think about their perspective on it. Yes. And even the surgeon is constrained sometimes by the environment they're working in. So understanding the hospital environment and what can be done and what mechanism comes for reimbursement of that, and the regulatory pathway that's going to get this, help you find a commercial partner that's going to invest the right amount of money to get this to market. All those things are key pieces in establishing the viability of an idea.
Yes, and I would say those are things that aren't necessarily always considered when you start a research project, right?
Oh, they're never considered, right? So when you start a research project, you're trying to solve a big picture problem.
Yes.
And especially at a university, often that may be a 10-year problem or longer, right? I can see what's out there right now isn't solving the problem. Getting there is hard, and you're going to make lots of little incremental advances along the way. Hopefully at some point a quantum leap and, this is new, this is cool, this is great. But at that point, then all of a sudden you have something that I can take over to you, Bennett, and we can file as a provisional patent and kind of get the ball rolling. But now I've started a clock, and I have a clock to establish relevancy of this. And if I haven't started thinking about all these other factors already, now I'm really in the headlights to try to figure out how to do that.
And then by the time it gets to us, sometimes, if some of those validating criteria for the commercialization haven't been thought of, then we're trying to figure that out as best we can, but there's a limit to what is available to us, right? Like what the market actually wants versus what was actually delivered, and we try to fill that gap as best we can. But the closer those things are together, by the time the technology comes to us, I feel like the faster it gets back out into industry.
Yeah, so I think the other key piece there is finding partners, right? Folks that are not engineers, folks that I interact with regularly that kind of feed the imagination, and finding, a research team and research collaborators that have different skill sets, different backgrounds, and they all feed into that as well. So I think, there's just this need to have kind of an ecosystem that can really drive the relevance of something.
Yes. No, and I think just a point of clarification for anybody listening is just because there isn't a market fit doesn't mean that it's not something you shouldn't pursue from a research perspective, right? Like, that's not at all what we're saying. But I think what we are saying is that it isn't overly surprising if there isn't a market fit if you're not thinking about some of these things, at least from a high, 50,000 foot level when you start some of this research.
Yeah, I think, going back to a question you asked earlier, right, the difference between working in industry versus working in academia, right? So is that part of it really is this ecosystem and this. So if I'm in industry and I come up with an idea, there are folks to almost immediately help me with the validation process.
Yes.
And that's fantastic. If I'm in academia, I may be divorced from that, and that may be a good thing, though.
Yes.
Right? Because I may be coming up with a brand new way to do something that may be fundamentally better, right? But when I go to find somebody to help get it to market, they're going to run into all kinds of barriers if it's fundamentally different.
Yes.
Right. So they're going to be trying to stick a square peg in a round hole, and they may find that the distribution system isn't set up for this, that the reimbursement isn't set up for this, that the surgeons don't know how to use this, that the key players here really don't know what to do with it, and you have to build that and teach them, and that is so much more inertia than plugging into an existing paradigm. But sometimes it can be paradigm shifting, and that's maybe the joy of being in an academic environment, is that you can feel free maybe to think in those ways. What's the paradigm shift that maybe should happen here?
Yeah, I think so. And I think as long as you're prepared for the speed at which that can be introduced, right? Because you can only change paradigms so quickly, right?
Yeah.
Especially in industries that are heavily regulated and have lots of hoops that you have to jump through to get big changes done. I think that that's an important insight for anybody trying to make those big leaps forward in the academic research, to understand that it might take a little bit of time and a little bit of effort to get enough momentum behind it to get it in place and have the impact that you ultimately hoped it always would have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And kind of a case study, I went back and I looked prior to this to see, we've got a technology we're working on right now that is kind of on fire. It's doing great. It's these wearable sensors that are really cool.
Yes.
I look back, the first paper we published on that, the first time we presented at a conference, was 2010.
Yes.
Like,
it's been a little while, yes.
And that was not actually the same technology that kind of ended up getting patented. It was an early, different variation on that, but we've been working in this field for a long time, and it took a lot of years to actually get it to the point where it seemed like, oh, this is viable now. Like, this could be cool. And then even longer than to convince others that it was really good. And so, it's this long process sometimes when something is just radically different.
Yes, absolutely. And that kind of leads really well into my next question for you, is surrounding failure. Failure in, both kind of arenas, academic failure as well as commercial failure. What is your experience with failure? We don't have to dive into anything too deep, right? We don't want to open old
try
wounds.
Not to share my personal experiences.
But failure can be informative into what your next steps might be, and how has that shaped maybe some of your decisions in your career?
Yeah, thankfully. So the IDEO group out at Stanford, you probably heard of them, right?
Yes.
And they have a saying, fail early and often to succeed sooner. Right?
Absolutely, yes.
And luckily, I failed early and often early in my career. And I think that was actually helpful, to see what things do work, what things don't work, to find this meld of how do I keep pursuing things as a professor, a researcher, that are going to lead to publications and ability for other labs to recognize what we're doing and internalize it and share. Kind of there's this open science, right?
Yes.
Which in some ways is in contrast to what you're trying to do with a new technology, where
Right.
you're kind of trying to keep it under wraps until it's ready to burst on the scene,
Mhm.
and then kind of guard it a little bit. And they're very different mindsets,
Yes.
but they can be complementary.
Definitely.
And so that's the piece that I think took me a while to figure out. What is that like? What things do you keep internal? What things
Mhm.
are you sharing? And you need to share the science. And you've
Absolutely.
got to have, for me, it's spine biomechanics. I got to have a home base that is very interesting to me. I'm trying to solve a research problem that's very difficult. Like, how do we solve chronic low back pain?
Mhm.
You know, this is something that is a 30-year problem, maybe
Yes.
for me. I'm hoping by the end of my career, I've made a dent in some way, right? And then along the way, have opportunities where you can see synergies
Mhm.
that might be technologies that can maybe accelerate this interest in chronic low back pain, but keeping your moorings as to where they
Right.
are. And periodically, the innovation on the device or the product side can also be really cool and driving publications.
Yeah, absolutely.
But sometimes those are delayed or not quite in the same order as you'd like to help with your advancement in rank and status and those
Right.
kind of things at the university. And you know, patents aren't often considered to be in the same category as a publication when
Right.
you're being reviewed, and innovation is seen kind of in a different light. Students love it, by
Yes.
the way, right? That's
Mhm.
something they want, is they all want to catch that vision, that excitement of seeing something new happen, and they want to be part of that process. And it's really rewarding to include them as part of that process.
Absolutely.
So I think it matches well with an educational environment, other than maybe our traditional ways of evaluating how well is a professor doing.
Yeah. And I think that comes with time and experience, right? Like, I'm sure that your perception of commercialization and patents and their value has changed probably fairly drastically from, year 1 to year 17. you know?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Great. Well, what other experiences have you had directly with commercialization? Stepping out of maybe your researcher shoes and into your commercialization shoes. Like, have they been positive generally? I mean, I know there's always setbacks and hurdles and roadblocks along the way, but
Yeah, so they have been positive. One of the early, it's been almost a decade. One of the insights I had was that we were coming up with cool technologies in the lab. People were coming in and picking them up at Tech Transfer and looking at them and say, that's really cool.
Mhm.
Like, I would love to see that go forward. And then they would put them back down and walk away.
Yes.
And I knew they were looking at this thing like this massive divide, the valley of death that kind
Mhm.
of separates a technology at a university from something that's a viable product.
Yes.
And I realized I knew very little about that.
Right.
And so on a personal level, I thought, out of these technologies, let me pick the one that I think is the very easiest to commercialize.
Mhm.
I'm going to pick up this wearable sensor thing that David Fulwood and I have been working on, and let's get it. Let's license it from the university,
Yes.
and we'll start up a little startup of our own, and we'll take that forward. And I learned there's no such thing as an easy product.
Right.
And all of my complaints that I had about these business folks that were picking up my
Mhm.
technologies, my little babies,
Yes,
right? Like
yes.
these personal,
They have all this potential
very
in the
special
world, yes.
that I could see how they would change the world. I could see why they would set them back down, because it is so much work.
They start running through the checklist of things they have to do, and they're like, "Ooh, that's getting longer." and longer." Yeah.
You haven't sorted out this problem yet. That's going to take, I'm not going to be able to bring on investor capital until this problem is solved, and you don't have an answer.
Yeah.
And the short answer is, that was we picked this up to try our own 2016.
Mhm.
we're still trying to get to the point where anybody buys one of these products.
And you guys have made a lot of progress.
We have.
Fair.
These are fantastic, by the way. Yeah, I mean, and we've had, from a fundamental kind of innovation, we've had a series of products that have kind of spun off, and some of them are so exciting. Like we have, these sensors. We've put them into a wearable sensor system on the back. That's we call the spine sense system.
Yes.
We just finished a massive study where we had these sensors on over 500 people, some of them with chronic low back pain, some of them without, some of them going through a clinical trial where they're, and we think we'll be able to use this data to be able to understand from 15 minutes of bending and twisting in their physician's office what might be the best treatment for this person. That would be amazing, right? This fundamental step forward. We've taken the same sensors and put them on a device that a pregnant mom can wear, and when the baby kicks or turns around, it measures that and lets mom know on an app, and she can then share that with her husband or her grandma or whoever, and they can share the joy. These are fun things built from a fundamental kind of technology.
Yeah.
But that process of getting it to market is it requires a very different skill set from being a professor.
Yes.
Right?
And that difference in skill set isn't necessarily something that you always understand if you haven't been through kind of that valley of death, as you phrased it. And to contextualize, maybe from the commercial perspective of why people might see, I don't want to call them flaws, but maybe red flags, right, in the research of questions that they feel like need to be answered. And maybe from a research perspective, it's like, I don't understand why that would need to be answered, right? But then you go through that process and it contextualizes it. Now you understand, right? Now you understand why there were so many concerns about different things, or maybe just one concern that had to be overcome. So that's an incredible insight.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a high energy way to learn a lesson, but definitely a good experience. Like at the end, come out knowing a lot more for being involved in some of that side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So what are your thoughts we've talked a little bit already about the difference between research and commercialization, and really the benefits of removing some of the constraints of commercialization on research, right? Can you think of any reasons why university research, where it might be helpful if it was more focused on commercialization, or do you feel like removing the constraint completely really does open up for those big paradigm shifting discoveries?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Really gets down to the fundamental nature of should all research be translational? Right. Is there a role for basic research that kind of moves things forward, but probably isn't ever going to result in something that, that makes a product, or that, is just understanding something for the sake of understanding it worthwhile? And I clearly feel the answer is yes. We should do those things. It's part of the benefit of being in a university environment. And having a protected space to do that doesn't require you to always have a product in mind, I think is really important. But when you have technologies that can and probably should interact with people, right, that should lead to some improvement in their life, into their in my field, into their health, which is so personal to all of us, right? Yes. Reducing pain or increasing our ability to accomplish and do things, then it absolutely should be commercialized, translated. Professors are not very good at doing that. Right. They need assistance. They need help. And I think technology transfer departments are really, they should be there, and they should be poised to help. So kind of finding that balance is good. You can get, as a professor, sometimes there can be a draw, like, well, wouldn't it be nice if, right?
Yes.
But I think most professors have chosen the field of being a professor because money wasn't the top thing on their mind.
Right.
Frankly, they had other things that they were also balancing and considering. And so often the underlying motivation may be simply to fix something, to do something, to make life better. And it's difficult as a professor sometimes to kind of try to convey that. I don't really care who's making the money. I want,
right.
But having been through a commercialization process, you realize that everything drives on somebody making a profit somewhere. That's how it gets out there. That's how, a technology actually leaves the lab and becomes impactful, is because people are making a living and making money along the way.
Yeah, and I love to point that out to people, that even if your driving force isn't monetary, right, somebody's is. And sometimes the path towards being the most impactful version of your discovery or your innovation, your technology, your research, can be through commercialization, right? By transferring that to industry and letting that grow and really impact in an organic way. And so it's something that I bring up, right? Because I hear that sometimes where researchers are like, well, I'm not worried about commercialization. I'm not worried about the money. But I think sometimes they can forget, right, that having the most impact might mean finding a way to commercialize it and for somebody to make money with that technology.
If I don't have a way to spend my purchasing dollars to get it,
yes,
then it's, how does it get out of the lab? There's no mechanism, and so there's this tension, but it's also a collaborative thing. Like, so, a market brings grounding, and it brings that relevance that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
It brings that to an aspect of research that helps us to make it real, not just theoretical.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I love that. I think both are important, but, kind of inherent is should universities somehow be different, right?
Mm-hmm.
Should there be some, in my dreams, I'd like to maybe have the university kind of recognize the innovation part maybe a little bit more than they often do.
Well, and kind of your comment earlier where patents aren't always viewed in the same light as research publications. And in an ideal world, from my perspective, I wish they would, right? I wish having your name on a patent was just as rewarding to you and your career as publishing in a research journal. Yeah.
But, and I agree with that sentiment. But universities move on very slow wheels.
Yes.
And I think you have to understand, at least I had to learn to understand, that that's probably not going to happen. And so why do you engage in this kind of activity then if you're not getting rewarded as much by the university for doing so? It's really because you are trying to benefit humanity. Well, it turns out that's also the driver for most research.
Yes,
Yes,
of course.
You kind of see
so much overlap here, in all those ventures.
And you see how it benefits students to be involved in that process, and you see how it leads to fundamental, advances, new technologies, new ways of measuring things, lead to incredible quantum leaps in our understanding of the world, and builds on basic science. There's this synergism that really should exist and does exist.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and at Tech Transfer, we love to be a sounding board, right? Sometimes you might be working on that foundational research, and maybe there is no path forward to commercialization. We still love to hear about what you're working on, right? And think about it, and maybe we know somebody who's in a related industry who might have some sort of perspective to put a spin on that research. So anyways, my advice to anybody doing what they feel like is fundamental research is, still reach out to Tech Transfer. Still let us know what you're working on. If nothing else, it's a fun conversation for us just to hear what it is that you're doing and for us to imagine how it might be impactful in the future.
Yeah, I love that. I think Tech Transfer plays a huge role in that. I also think there's other folks, like other stakeholders. For me, it's talking to surgeons. And an insight that I come up with in the lab after talking to them, I'm like, oh, wait, maybe that's also something that can benefit them if we can figure out the product that bridges the need with the understanding. That can drive really impactful things. And similarly, you can talk to folks who are on the financial side, and they'll be like, oh, this is a pain point for me. And you're like, oh, well, actually, we could do that differently. There's different ways to do that. And maybe we can do some research in that area that'll change that paradigm. And so I think the stakeholder group really can be so enabling. Tech transfer and
it can be very different than what you imagine it might be, right? Like you mentioned, like the finance portion of the health industry. Like you typically wouldn't, going into a research project, assume that they would be a part of any kind of decision-making process, or they're just dealing with the finance. But their insights into the pain and how things might be structured ever so slightly differently to help in the entire, I keep going back to commercialization, but just in the entire development of this new technology can be incredibly insightful.
Yeah, I think listening can often go so far. And, I think before I was an inventor myself, right, I think I had this vision of kind of the lone inventor toiling away in the lab late at night, and then there's this eureka moment and good things happen, and that just hasn't been my experience. Right. To me, it's more of this chaotic storm of innovation that happens when you have the right people in the room who are all thinking and attacking a problem together and saying, well, what about this and what about this? And it kind of forms this kind of synergistic maelstrom of ideas that sometimes could then coalesce into, this is it.
That aha
this is what we should do.
Finally understanding, yes.
But it's much more social than I thought it was. And I love that. And that's one of the things I love to see students be a part of, is this craziness of this invention process.
And the chaos. I love that word that you use. Just it can feel chaotic, especially coming from maybe an engineering mindset where everything needs to be in order and organized and logical, and the chaos that goes into, distilling that idea, taking everybody's input and making it into something can be uncomfortable for engineers, but it can be very rewarding as well.
One of the basic questions for a patent is, would someone with a basic skill in the art have already seen that, right? And that chaos, I think, is what jumps over that. No, gets out of our preconceived notions as to how a problem should be solved and helps us to see something different.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, we are running a little short on time, but thank you so much for joining us. Did you have any additional thoughts or comments that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, thank you. Appreciate all you guys are doing.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you again for being here. We really appreciate it.